Good day, future educators. Do you want to fill your minds with a powerful lesson today? So, let's learn together the association of the stimulus response theories. For our first discussant, we have Kathleen F1 to discuss the SR theory, or also known as stimulus response theory. So, come on and let's learn together.
Who is Edward Lee Thorndike and what is he known for? Edward Lee Thorndike was an American psychologist and educator who pioneered the development of behavioral psychology and learning theory. His groundbreaking research on animal learning led to the formulation of S&R theory and law of learning, including the law of effect, law of exercise, and law of Thorndike's influential work laid the foundation for modern educational psychology, behavioral science, and applied psychology fields. But let us first discover what is his theory about and how can it be a great help for educational technology. So Thorndike's S&R theory, also known as connectionism and associationism, explains learning through associations between stimuli and responses. Stimulus is the environmental cues or events that trigger responses. Response, on the other hand, is the behavioral reaction to stimuli. And connection or association is the bond between stimulus and response that can be strengthened through repetition. So Thorndike's stimulus-response theory proposes that learning occurs through association between environmental stimuli and behavioral responses. The theory suggests that responses followed by satisfaction or reward strengthen associations, while those followed by discomfort or punishment weaken them. Repetition and reinforcement solidify connections, leading to automatic responses. This theory emphasizes observable behavior, associative learning, and has influenced behavioral psychology in education. And now, let us proceed with Thorndike's laws of learning. First, we have the law of effect. So, law of effect states that satisfaction or reward strengthen association. Thorndike's law of effect states that behaviors followed by satisfying or pleasant consequences strengthen the connection between stimulus and response. Conversely, behaviors followed by unpleasant consequences weaken the connection, reducing future occurrences. So second, we have the law of exercise. So this law states that association strengthen through repetition and weaken through disuse. So Thorndike's law of exercise states that connections between stimuli and responses strengthen with repetition and practice, solidifying learning. Regular repetition reinforces the connection, making behaviors more automatic, while infrequent use weakens the connection. Lastly, we have the law of readiness. So this law states that learning occurs when individuals are mentally prepared. So Thorndike's law of readiness states that learning occurs when an individual is mentally prepared and motivated to respond to a stimulus. When readiness is present, associations between stimuli and responses form more easily, facilitating effective learning. Here are some strategies in preparing instructional designs based on SR theory. First, repeat lessons, exercises, or quizzes to strengthen associations. Second, organize content into logical sequences, facilitating connections. Third, provide immediate feedback, rewards, or praise for correct responses. Fourth, use analogies, metaphors, or mind maps to connect new information to prior knowledge. Fifth, teach students to create associations using visualization. Sixth, use real-life examples to illustrate connections. And lastly, encourage group work, discussions, and peer teaching to foster connections. So, in conclusion, the stimulus response theory greatly aids the educational psychology and classroom instruction by helping teachers design effective learning experiences, associate new information with meaningful stimuli, and reinforce desired behavior. By applying SR principles, educators can create engaging lessons and facilitate habit formation. This theory also informs assessments and modification of instructional strategies to optimize student learning outcomes.
Good morning, brilliant minds. Ready to explore and expand our understanding together. I am Anna James Franca, your discussant for today. So now, our topic is all about the classical conditioning. So classical conditioning is a fundamental associative learning process developed by Ivan Pavlov. His research into the physiology of digestion led him logically to create a science of conditioned reflexes. Classical conditioning refers to learning that occurs when a neutral stimulus, example a sound, becomes associated with a stimulus. An example is food that naturally produces a behavior. So to take an example, a person may start to salivate in the presence of his or her favorite food. In relation, hearing the sound, however, repeated exposures to these two forms of stimulus may create a certain association. After the association is learned, the previously neutral stimulus is sufficient to produce the behavior. Simply put, it can be defined as a type of learning in which a stimulus acquires the capacity to evoke a reflexive response that was originally evoked by a different stimulus. From his early work on the physiology of digestion, Pavlov knew that dogs would salivate not just on taking food into the mouth, but in response to a range of other events. For instance, at the approach of the laboratory attendant who supplied the food. The ability of such events to evoke this reflex depended, Pavlov suspected, on the animals, having experienced them major to feeding. To demonstrate this in the laboratory, he set up training procedure in which he could control exactly which events a dog experienced. So as shown in the picture, a turning fork is sounded and after a brief interval, meat is presented to the dog. The dog responds to the food in the usual manner. It salivates, chews, and swallows. So, before conditioning signifies that food elicits a response that is automatic, that is unconditioned. During conditioning, the sound of the turning fork is present when the meat, the unconditioned stimulus, is presented. While the unconditioned response is taking place, the dog associated the sound with the meat and its reaction to the meat. And after conditioning, now elicits a response formerly elicited by the food. A conditioned response, which was a part of the original unconditioned response, is now established. Unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus which naturally and automatically triggers a response. So the response to such a stimulus is called unconditioned response. This response is the unlearned response that occurs naturally to an unconditioned stimulus. In Pavlov's experiment, the sight or taste of food was an unconditioned stimulus for the unconditioned response of salivating. This pairing does not need training in order to be established. On the other hand, conditioned stimulus is a previously neutral stimulus that after becoming associated with the unconditioned stimulus eventually comes to trigger a conditioned response. So the learned process is called conditioned response. In Pavlov's experiment, the sound process is called the conditioned response. And on the other hand, the sound was conditioned stimulus for the conditioned response of salivating. In conclusion, The classical conditioning involves the association of an unconditioned and a conditioned stimulus in such a way that the conditioned stimulus elicits unconditioned response. There is the formation or strengthening of an association between a conditioned stimulus in a controlled relationship with an unconditioned stimulus that originally elicits that response. So now, to further elaborate the reflex or classical theory, let us call on Ms. Kiana Loren to further elaborate this topic.
Good morning to everyone. I'm Kiana Loren. I'm here to further explain and continue the discussion of Summa Franca of classical conditioning. So psychologists explain learning primarily in terms of associating two stimuli or stimuli with responses through first order or primary and high-order classical conditioning. An example of this is a child acquires his initial single word vocabulary through associating names with their reference and later speaks in phrases and then in sentences through chaining or associating consecutively the words that comprise the sentences. And classical conditioning theory explains the simplest form of learning which relies on the relatively mechanistic process of reinforcement for the formation and strengthening of association between stimulus and response. This theory has several principles, which among are excitation, extinction, stimulus generalization, and spontaneous recovery. So let's start with the first principle of classical conditioning, which is called excitation or acquisition. This law is also known as the law of acquisition. This happens when a previously neutral stimulus acquires the property of eliciting the conditioned response. In the classical conditioning, it consists of unconditional response, unconditioned and a neutral stimulus, which introduced by Summa Franca a while ago, and unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, and unconditioned response, which is the salvation of the dog, and the NS, which is the bell. So, Ivan Pavlov, which experimented the dog salvation and acquiring the food, salvation, and bell. The unconditioned stimulus is the food and unconditioned response is the salvation of the dog. In acquisition or the excitation, the neutral stimulus should not, or the dog should not respond on the sound of the bell. An unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, accompanied with the bell or the NS or the neutral stimulus, and the response to in salvation, which is if the bell and the food is accompanied or they are put together to know if the dog will salvate. The result of the experiment of Ivan Pavlov, the dog salvate so much. Acquisition, there are three factors crucially impact of that result of that experiment. The first one is the stimulus salience, which is the loudness or the impact of the sound of the neutral stimulus, which is the bell. And the second is the stimulus order, when S plus UCS, NS or the neutral stimulus will always come first rather than UCS. The dogs will acquire the neutral stimulus to become the conditioned stimulus. And the last one is the time between the trials or the presentation of each stimulus. So the trial should not take so much delay. Like the first example, this should be the trial 1. The second trial should be presented 2 minutes or 30 seconds to 1 minute rather, and for the trial 2. And next is the UNS or the neutral stimulus should not take the UCS rather, unconditional stimulus should not be take so much delay to be presented to achieve the response or the conditional response. So next is the extinction. This process is also called unlearning. This occurs when the conditioned response is no longer elicited by the conditioned stimulus because the conditioned stimulus was constantly presented without the parent stimulus. When food is not presented after a series of presentations of the metronome sound, salivation is most likely to happen. Extinction it means exit or extracting the one stimulus of the classical conditioning. In the extinction, the NS or the neutral stimulus will still remain on in that scenario, and the unconditioned stimulus is extracted or out of that scenario. So in the extinction, the neutral stimulus is presented repeatedly in a specific time until a trial pen, which results to the rejecting the unconditional response of or the salivation of the dog, which weakens the conditioned stimulus, which result in the extinction of the conditioned response. And conditioned stimulus is presented done, it goes back to neutral stimulus, which they expected the neutral stimulus, it will not receive any response or any effect of the dog or the salivation. So next of the principle is spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery, a conditioned response which does not appear for sometimes, reoccurs without further conditioning. If the dog is brought out the experimental setup for sometimes and then brought back, it may salivate or the conditional response at the sound of the buzzer, the conditional stimulus. In spontaneous recovery, it means you slowly go back or you slowly put in a scenario the conditional stimulus, which is the food. And the extinction is you extract the food, which result to the rejection or the salivation doesn't occur because the dog or the neutral stimulus or the conditional stimulus, which is the bell, goes back to neutral stimulus. So spontaneous recovery is after the pause of the sound of the bell elicited the salivation. Spontaneous recovery of response extinction doesn't lead to unlearning the stimulus response. It means in spontaneous recovery, the dog recovers because the conditional stimulus goes back, which is the food. So the conditioned response elicited during the spontaneous recovery phase is lesser compared to the acquisition phase or the conditioned response that we observe on acquisition phase, which is the salivation of the two phases. Next is the stimulus generalization. This process occurs when the conditioned response is not elicited by the original conditioned stimulus, but by rather similar to the conditioned stimulus. So example of this is the NS, the original NS, which is the bell, is replaced to the xylophone, which they have like a similar sound. So in the stimulus generalization, is the conditioned response or the dog response is or salivate to the sound of the xylophone, the same to the bell. The opposite of the stimulus generalization is the stimulus discrimination, in which a subject learns to respond to one stimulus but not to a similar stimulus. So, example of this is that the NS, or the neutral or the condition, the now conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, and replaced by the piano. In stimulus discrimination, the dog the dog doesn't salivate on the sound of the piano, even though they are similar, that produces sound. So, because they're in an aspect that they are not similar with the tone of the instrument. That's all for the fourth principle of the classical conditioning by Ivan Pavlov. Again, the first is acquisition or excitation. Next is extinction. Third is the spontaneous recovery. And the fourth is stimulus generalization and the stimulus discrimination. So next is classical conditioning outside the laboratory. The first one is the classical conditioning occurs inside the laboratory. So in this discussion, even though classical conditioning accounts for much of how reflexive behavior is transferred from an unconditioned stimulus to a new stimulus, it does not clearly account for behavior that has not a distinct stimulus. Example is walking, playing, and cooking a meal. Nor for totally novel behavior, example is making utterances never heard before, problem-solving behavior. It seems that in this aspect of learning, apparent conditioning does not fully explain the process involved. An example of classical conditioning that occurs outside the laboratory is it offers a mean of understanding behavior that is usually called involuntary behavior. So involuntary behavior, example of this is when you reacted on a certain situation that involves our emotional responses, even though we don't want them to happen or we want them to happen. So next example is the research in classical conditioning has also led to much of what has become the basis for behavioral modification or behavioral therapy, particularly with behavior disorders. Or one type of therapy that the psychologists come up to is the systematic desensitization techniques. Offer varying stimuli and provide the individual with coping responses to these varied stimuli. The systematic desensitization can be connected to classical conditioning in terms of pairing the two stimulus, the fear and the relaxing factors, and it is used by the psychologist or to help the patient who has an anxiety or phobias to cope of that fear or that situation. And next will be Lady Villiver to further discuss the B.F. Skinner apparent conditioning.
Hello, hi, konnichiwa, maayong udto. So I am Lady Villiver, your discussant for today. I will be discussing the B.F. Skinner's theory of operant conditioning. So operant conditioning was derived from the theory of Thorndike, and this operant conditioning was developed by Burrhus Frederick, or known as B.F. Skinner. So this theory is a type of learning where behavior is controlled by consequences. It focuses on how the environment influences an individual's behavior through reinforcement and punishment. The operant conditioning theory is based on Skinner's experiments with animals. Skinner uses the term operant behavior to refer to his idea that an organism has to do something in order to get a reward, that is, it must operate on its environment. So his basic premise is that any organism, including man, tends to repeat what it was doing at the time its behavior was reinforced, and that the task is a matter of creating each step of the way. thus gradually leading the subject to the required performance. So his famous experiment is a rat in a box, or known as Skinner's box. So this hungry rat was placed in a box. Upon its accidental pressing of a lever in a box, it was rewarded with a food fillet which served as reinforcement to the pressing behavior. Reinforced, thus, the rat kept on pressing that bar, this time no longer accidentally but intentionally. So why intentionally? Because the rat has learned that its present behavior would reward him with a food fillet. Another example of this is a trained bird in a bird show. So have you noticed the birds in a bird show? They perform tasks or perform activities exactly what they are told to perform, and they would get a reward from it. But on the other hand, if the bird that is unexposed from this and you tell or signal the bird to turn around, do you think the bird would turn around immediately? No, it would not turn around immediately. However, if it is rewarded with a food each time it performs a desired action, the bird begins to associate turning around with receiving a reward. Over time, the bird performs the action consistently because the behavior has been strengthened by the repeated reinforcement. So, Skinner has shown that basic to operant conditioning is the use of reinforcement. So, now let's proceed to the 4 key components of Skinner's operant conditioning, which are the reinforcement, punishment, extinction, and shaping. For the reinforcement, this is a process where behavior is strengthened by a consequence that follows it. It can be positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. So, for the positive reinforcement, this is the adding something pleasant to increase the likelihood of a behavior. Example is giving a reward or praise for good behavior. And for the negative reinforcement, removing something unpleasant to increase the likelihood of a behavior. For example, stopping loud noise when the desired action is performed. So, do you remember the food fillet and the food reward of rat and the bird every time it performs a desired action? That is the reinforcement, and specifically the positive reinforcement, because it adds something pleasant to increase the likelihood of a bird to repeat the behavior. Reinforcement increases the rate of responding. However, elimination of the reinforcing consequence decreases the rate. For the rest of the components of operant conditioning, we have Merrifield Bantilan to discuss further the information right to your brain.
Good day, future educators. I am teacher Merrifield Bantilan. Before I begin my discussion, I'd like you to picture out this scenario. Child A receives praises every time he goes at school early. On the other hand, Child B faces consequences for being tardy. From your own perspective, how would each behavior affect their studies? Do they need to change their behavior? Today, we're going to explore the concepts of reinforcement and punishment and how it shapes the behavior and motivation of students. There are 2 types of reinforcement: the primary reinforcement and the secondary reinforcement. Primary reinforcements are stimuli that are naturally reinforcing, meaning they do not require any training to be effective. This is biologically significant and have intrinsic meaning, as it satisfies the human's basic needs. Primary reinforcers are powerful to increase the chance of a particular behavior to occur. Some examples of primary reinforcers are food, water, and sleep. Food can be served as primary reinforcer in a school setting. As future educators, we can offer food to students who may have completed their tasks. This approach can motivate them to complete their assigned tasks. Also, this can help them to satisfy the hunger of students who may not have taken their meal yet. Another example is allowing students to take a break or nap after a lengthy discussion or heavy task. This can help them to relax and refocus for the next activity. In contrast to primary reinforcer is the secondary reinforcement. Secondary reinforcers influence behavior through training. Kahit secondary reinforcer, kaya mag-need siya of training para ma-occur. Examples of these are money, star, token, and praises. As future educators, we should praise our students for performing well at class. In this way, we can motivate them to keep their good performance. Also, this can increase their self-esteem. Another example is providing stars to students. Teachers at preschool or kindergarten give stars to students depending on their performance. Let's proceed to generalized reinforcers. Generalized reinforcers is a type of secondary reinforcer that has been paired with multiple primary reinforcers. Some examples of generalized reinforcers are approval, attention, and congratulations. As future educators, we should congratulate students for their achievements, no matter how small or big it is. In this way, they can feel a sense of recognition and approval, which can motivate them to continue to perform well. In contrast to reinforcement is punishment. Punishment is a consequences that reduces the likelihood of the behavior to occur in the future through withdrawal of positive or negative reinforcement. Skinner emphasized that individuals' behavior are shaped and managed by our consequences. For Skinner, punishment can lead to three undesirable behaviors. First, punished responses only disappear temporarily. Punishment may temporarily suppress an undesirable behavior, but it cannot totally eliminate it. The individual may stop the undesirable behavior to avoid or escape the punishment in a short time. However, once this punishment is no longer applied or exists, the undesirable behavior may return. For instance, most of the students are often late at school. To discipline them, the teacher provides a consequence such as marking them as absent. To avoid the consequences, the student began at arriving on time. However, once the punishment is no longer exists or applied, the students start arriving late again. Second, emotional predisposition such as guilt or shame. When punishment is used frequently or harshly, it can lead to negative. Second, emotional predisposition such as guilt or shame may be conditioned through the use of punishment. When punishment is used frequently and harshly, this can lead to various negative emotional responses such as guilt, shame, embarrassment, and anxiety and depression. For instance, a student is struggling with history, especially in remembering important events. Every time her teacher asks her, she answers it incorrectly. As a result, she is frequently scolded in front of the class, which can lead her to feel embarrassed or shamed. Third, any behavior that reduces the aversive stimulation accompanying the punishment will be reinforced. When a behavior is punished, an individual might perform another behavior to escape or avoid the punishment. For instance, a student forgot to do his homework. To avoid the consequences, he started lying that she forgot it at home or she misplaced it. Through lying, the students escape the consequences. Sa kanya siya kay ang undesirable behavior kay maadon siya og laing nga undesirable behavior. First, katong kuan, wala siya nakahimog assignment. Nilugawan og paglaing niya, which is another undesirable behavior. Next is the extension. Extension occurs when a behavior that once followed a reinforcement no longer receive that reinforcement, causing the behavior to diminish. Extension, kay kung wala na gali ang reinforcement or dili na mahatagan o reinforcement ang isa ka behavior, na ay possibility nga mawala ni siya. For instance, when a student is used to receive compliments for completing her task, however, the student no longer receive that compliment. This can lead her to lost interest to finish her task. Diba sa scenario atong nakita, nga nagkawala ang interest sa bata na maghimo sa iyang task, kaya wala na may reinforcement. Lastly is shaping. Shaping behavior is the acquisition of complex behaviors. The procedure of first reinforcing responses that only resemble the desired response is referred to as reinforcing successive approximation. Shaping is a technique used to teach complex behaviors. Kaya kung magtudlo ka, dapat mag-una dyan sa simple pag-utabadyo sa complex, so that students can easily understand. For instance, in writing a sentence, we should teach them step-by-step process. Then, simple math equation, dapat taruhon jud nato o explain sa mga bata ang sakto nga process. Again, what are the four components of B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning? Reinforcement, punishment, extinction, and shaping. Thank you so much for listening.